The cold October rain turned the road from Paris to Versailles into a viscous mess, making the horses slip and snort with strain. But inside the carriage, an unnatural, almost ringing silence reigned. The coach bore no coat of arms, its windows tightly draped with heavy velvet that allowed neither a ray of light nor a casual glance from a passerby to penetrate. In the corner, huddled against the soft upholstery, sat a 15-year-old girl whose fingers clutched the edge of a simple woolen shawl until they turned white. Her name was Marie, though very soon she was destined to forget it. She had been told she was chosen for a special service, that her poor family would never again know want, that a fate awaited her that princesses would envy. But fear, sticky and cold, crept down her spine. Why was she being taken at night? Why was she forbidden to say goodbye to her neighbors? Why was the coachman silent, as if he were transporting not a living person, but a secret cargo? The carriage turned into a labyrinth of narrow streets in a quiet district known as the Deer Park. Once, royal hunts had resounded here, but now this area had become a refuge for a different kind of pursuit, the chase for fleeting youth and salvation from boredom. The heavy gates of an inconspicuous mansion opened, admitting the carriage into the inner courtyard, and immediately slammed shut, cutting off the path back. The girl was met by an elderly woman with an emotionless face and eyes that had seen too many secrets. From this moment, Marie's life began, resembling a prolonged, strange dream where luxury intertwined with prison-like strictness and the highest honor bordered on the deepest humiliation. She had fallen into the very center of Louis XV's secret empire, into a mechanism created to satisfy the whims of one man and preserve the power of another woman, the all-powerful Marquise de Pompadour. To understand the tragedy unfolding within the walls of this house, one must look into the soul of the man for whom it was built. Louis XV, whom the people adored as the Beloved at the beginning of his reign, had by the middle of the century transformed into a man torn by inner demons. He became king at 5 years old, having outlived all his relatives, and this early encounter with loss left an indelible mark on him. His main affliction was not cruelty or foolishness, but a total, all-consuming boredom mixed with deep melancholy. Versailles, with its endless etiquette, where every step of the monarch was a public spectacle, suffocated him. He lacked air. He needed the illusion of a private life, a place where he could be not God's anointed, responsible for 25 million souls, but simply a man. It was precisely this psychological breaking point that Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson, Marquise de Pompadour, brilliantly exploited. By the early 1750s, her physical relationship with the king had ceased. Doctors had forbidden her intimate life due to her delicate health, and it seemed her influence was destined to crumble. Whispers already circulated at court, choosing a new favorite from among the noble duchesses. But Pompadour was a strategist, whose mind any general might envy. She understood. If a woman from the upper echelons of society entered the king's bed, she would immediately demand power, titles for her relatives, and a place in the royal council. This would mean the end of the Pompadour era. The solution was paradoxical and cynical. To maintain power, she herself had to supply the king with women, but women who could never become rivals. Simple, unaristocratic, naive. Those who would see the king as a god, but be unable to offer him any political advice. Thus was created the Parc aux Cerfs, a unique institution, unparalleled in the history of European monarchies. It was not merely a house of assignation. It was a boarding school, a finishing school, and a gilded cage all at once. Girls whose beauty was their only dowry were brought here. And here began their transformation, which for many became a personal tragedy. The inner world of these girls was split in two. They were taught manners, dancing, music, the art of dressing, and maintaining light conversation. They were prepared for an encounter with a mysterious __0_. Yet, they were kept in strict isolation. They were forbidden to go into the city, to write letters without inspection, or to receive visitors. Imagine the state of young Louise or Marie, torn from the Parisian artisan class. Suddenly she finds herself surrounded by silks, porcelain, and silver. She is told she is chosen. She is fed exquisite dishes, dressed like a doll. She begins to believe in a fairy tale. She awaits her prince. And when the __1_ appears, an aging but still imposing man who introduces himself as a Polish count or a relative of the king, she falls in love. Not with a person, but with an image. She tries to please. She gives all her untamed tenderness. But with time, the veil lifts. The girls were young but not foolish. Servants would let slip, or the __2_ himself would forget about the conspiracy, and then came the moment of terrible realization. Their beloved was the King of France. One might think this ought to cause delight, but for the inhabitants of the Parc aux Cerfs, this discovery became a source of constant anxiety. They understood they could not be the king's equal. They realized their temporariness. In their rooms, at night, when the noise of the Versailles festivities quieted, real dramas unfolded. The girls dreamed of securing their position, of becoming the new official favorite, of repeating Cinderella's path. They were jealous of each other, concocted naive schemes, tried to get pregnant, believing that a child would be their anchor, their guarantee of security. The pregnancy was the culmination of their hopes and the beginning of their end. The king loved children, but he could not allow bastards to proliferate at court. As soon as a girl's condition became noticeable, or as soon as she gave birth, the system's mechanism mercilessly cast her out. Their infants were taken away. This was the cruelest part of the bargain, one no one warned them about at the start. The child was taken away, given to foster families, and provided for, but the mother was forbidden from having contact with it. She received a dowry, a husband was found for her somewhere in a distant province, and she disappeared from the monarch's life forever. Imagine the trauma. To be elevated to the pinnacle of the world, to bear a child by the most powerful man in Europe, and then to be erased, deprived of both child, love, and status, sent to live out her days with a stranger, keeping a dangerous secret that could cost her life. The most famous victim and simultaneously symbol of this system was Louise O'Murphy, daughter of an Irish shoemaker. Her beauty was captured by the artist François Boucher, and it was this portrait, rumor had it, that caught the king's eye. Louise stayed at the Parc aux Cerfs longer than others. She even tried to dabble in politics, naively believing that the king's love would protect her. She dared to ask Louis, "How is your old wife?" referring to Madame de Pompadour. This was a fatal mistake. Pompadour did not forgive when tools began to speak. Louise was married off and removed with lightning speed. The system worked flawlessly. Feelings, attachments, human destinies, everything was ground up for the comfort of one person. The financial side of this enterprise was monstrous. While France was fighting the exhausting 7 Years' War, when soldiers lacked boots and the fleet rotted without repair, millions of livres were spent on maintaining the Parc aux Cerfs. Agents scoured the entire country in search of __1_, paying for the services of midwives, wet nurses, tutors, and buying silence and conscience. The treasury emptied, taxes rose, and the people began to murmur. But the king preferred not to notice reality. He created an artificial world for himself, a cocoon in which he could hide from state problems. However, reality has a way of intruding uninvited. On January 5, 1757, Louis XV's fragile world of illusions was shattered. On that frosty evening, the king was descending the marble staircase of Versailles, heading for his carriage. Guards crowded around, courtiers held torches, their flames flickering in the wind, casting ominous shadows. Suddenly, a figure detached itself from the darkness. A man in a tattered coat broke through the cordon like a ghost and struck the king in his right side. It all happened so fast, no one had time to react. Louis staggered and uttered the phrase that would become historical. "Someone elbowed me!" But bringing his hand to his side, he saw blood. Warm, thick blood on royal fingers. At that moment, time stopped for him. It wasn't just a stab wound, it was the collapse of the universe. For the first time in a century and a half, since the assassination of Henry IV, a subject's hand had been raised against the sacred person of the monarch. The assailant, Robert François Damiens, was immediately apprehended, but for the king, it no longer mattered. He was gripped by primitive, animalistic terror. The wound turned out to be shallow. The penknife Damiens was armed with had a blade only a few inches long, and the thick layers of winter clothing, velvet, silk, linen, softened the blow. The monarch's life was not in danger, but the psychological wound was mortal. Louis XV, despite his lifestyle, was a deeply, almost superstitiously religious man. He lived in constant fear of hell. Every night at the Parc aux Cerfs was a sin for him, which he tried to atone for. But now, seeing his own blood, he decided that the hour of reckoning had come. He was convinced that the knife was poisoned, that he was dying, and that in a few hours he would face the last judgment. Panic erupted in Versailles, escalating into a political crisis. The king locked himself in his chambers, refusing to see anyone but doctors and priests. He lay in bed, surrounded by the scent of incense and the whisper of prayers, preparing for death. For the __1_ party, a group at court advocating strict morality and hating Pompadour, it was their moment of glory. They surrounded the bed of the __2_ man in a tight circle. Confessors whispered to the king that this assassination attempt was a sign of God's wrath, punishment for debauchery, for the Parc aux Cerfs, for his liaison with the impious Marquise. The condition for absolution and the salvation of his soul was the complete and immediate removal of Madame de Pompadour and the closing of the den of iniquity. For several days, France balanced on a knife edge. Madame de Pompadour sat in her apartments, hearing courtiers who just yesterday sought her patronage, now rushing past her doors, avoiding even looking her way. Her suitcases were packed. She awaited the order of expulsion. Friends had betrayed her, enemies triumphed. In this silence and isolation, the fate not only of the favorite but of the entire political system of the kingdom was being decided. The king, meanwhile, was undergoing a painful internal transformation. The fear of death forced him to publicly repent before the queen. He asked forgiveness from the wife he had ignored for years. He promised to change his life, to become righteous. It seemed the story of the Parc aux Cerfs was over, and the gates of the mansion would close forever. But days passed. The poison did not act. The fever did not begin. The wound healed with astonishing speed. The king got out of bed, walked around the room, and realized that he was alive. And with the return of physical strength, the mystical horror began to recede. The fear of hell faded before the habit of living. The priests, who just yesterday seemed to be saviors of the soul, now annoyed him with their moralizing. The king again felt that familiar, lingering boredom. He became unbearably nauseated by the solemn faces, by the prayers, by the queen's reproachful gaze. He needed air. He needed Pompadour, the only one who did not demand holiness from him, but simply understood his weaknesses. The return to his former life was not instantaneous, but inevitable. The Marquise de Pompadour, showing miraculous endurance, did not leave. She waited for the moment when the king himself would call her. And he did call. First for a business conversation, then for dinner, and then everything returned to normal. The Parc aux Cerfs not only resumed its operation, it became even more closed, even more cynical. The king, having survived the fear of death, seemed to decide to make up for lost time, to drown out the memories of Damien's knife with new pleasures. But now, there was some kind of doom in it. If before it was a search for joy, now it was an escape from reality. Damien's execution became the apotheosis of the old regime's cruelty. He was quartered in the Place de Grève before a huge crowd. The condemned man's suffering lasted for hours. The executioners struggled with their task. The horses could not tear the body apart. The crowd watched this spectacle with horror and disgust. But instead of intimidating the people, this execution had the opposite effect. People saw not just retribution, but the agony of a power that could only protect itself with medieval torture. Damien's blood left an indelible stain on Louis's reputation. In the underground pamphlets that now flooded Paris, the king was called a tyrant, and his Parc aux Cerfs a den of beasts devouring the children of the people. After Madame de Pompadour's death in 1764, many hoped that the king would settle down. He was already over 50, he was a grandfather, his health was failing. The mansion in the Parc aux Cerfs quarter was indeed sold, but not out of repentance. It was just that the education system seemed too complicated and long to the king. He no longer wanted to play the educator. Hidden vice was replaced by overt, screaming vice. The appearance of Madame du Barry, a former street courtesan whom the king officially introduced to the court, became the final nail in the coffin of monarchical prestige. If the Parc aux Cerfs was hypocrisy, an attempt to maintain outward decency, then du Barry was a challenge. But it was the Parc aux Cerfs that laid the foundation for the hatred that would explode 20 years later. For the common Frenchman, the court's expenses were unfathomable. Rumors multiplied the costs tenfold. It was said that the king spent on his women enough to maintain an entire army. This mathematics of injustice was simple and understandable to everyone, from the Parisian porter to the rural curate. The king ceased to be the father of the nation. He became a parasite on the body of the country. The sacredness of power, the belief in the divine right of the Bourbons, was destroyed not by Enlightenment philosophers, but precisely by these closed carriages that shuttled between Paris and Versailles. When Louis XV died of smallpox in 1774, his body had to be buried at night, hastily, to avoid popular insults. He left his grandson, the virtuous but weak Louis XVI, a bankrupt country, and a people who had learned to hate. Parc aux Cerfs became a legend, a myth that grew with new, gruesome details. Revolutionary agitators used this image as a powerful weapon. In the public consciousness, the Bastille and Parc aux Cerfs merged into a single image of tyranny. In one prison, the bodies of patriots rotted. In the other, the souls of the innocent were corrupted. Today, walking through the quiet streets of Versailles, it is difficult to imagine that behind the facades of humble mansions, the fates of the monarchy were once decided. But history teaches us that walls have memory. The tragedy of Parc aux Cerfs is not just a story of royal dalliances. It is a story of how absolute power, devoid of responsibility and feedback from society, inevitably begins to devour itself. The isolation of the elite, the transformation of people into tools, the expenditure of state resources on personal whims, all this creates a critical mass of anger, for which one spark is enough to detonate. And in the finale, we again see the same image. Night, fog, the clatter of hooves on the cobblestones, but now the carriage is not carrying young Marie towards her strange fate. This phantom carriage is carrying an entire era into oblivion. The splendor of Versailles, the gallant festivities, the powdered wigs, and the rustle of crinolines, all this is doomed. There, beyond the horizon, the dawn of a new, cruel day is already breaking, when the bills issued in the boudoirs of Parc aux Cerfs will be presented for payment on the scaffold of the Place de la Révolution. And the payment will not be gold, but royal blood.